Well, I think we'll get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is David Reed, Executive Director of the Chesapeake Legal Alliance. As we get started, just wanted to let everyone know this meeting is being recorded. Also, if you have questions during, and certainly towards the end, we'll leave a fair amount of time for questions. Please put them in the, use the chat function to put them in a comment. Will, are you ready to go?
Yes.
Okay. So today we're going to be talking about Chesapeake Legal Alliance's work and some recent developments. So who is CLA? We are, for those of you not familiar, we're a dynamic team of attorney advocates providing pro bono legal services to the Bay watershed. Our staff is Evan Isaacson, Director of Research, and Angela Herron, both Director of Innovation, both directors of the Environmental Action Center. Molly Brown is the Director of our Legal Education Center, and Patrick DeArmy is the Supervising Attorney within the Environmental Action Center. Will Halnan is our Staff Attorney and Director of Outreach. Eugene Wilson is our Operations Manager, and Denise Swoll is our Director of Development. You'll see Eliza Smith-Steinmeier in our staff picture, our dearly departed co-director. The current Chesapeake Legal Alliance is a product of a merger between the Chesapeake Legal Alliance and the Environmental Action Center, of which I was formerly director. Eliza took over the Chesapeake Legal Alliance a little more than 4 years ago and started building programs within it. And around 2019, she and I began discussing how the Chesapeake Legal Alliance and the Environmental Action Center could work together to build more capacity for legal advocacy in the watershed. And during that time, we thought, well, because EAC is an advocacy and litigation shop, we should bring that to the Chesapeake Legal Alliance's pro bono attorney network. With that merger, we developed 3 centers: the Community Outreach Center, the Legal Education Center, and the Environmental Action Center. This allows CLA to be both responsive and proactive. The Outreach Center helps Bay advocates, organizations, and communities with pro bono legal services and works with clients to understand community legal needs and match them with a network attorney. The idea being outreach and to expand both our constituency, but also our volunteer attorney network. And of course, our outreach includes development philanthropy to increase support for our work. Our education center is, of course, increasing the Bay community's understanding and use of environmental laws to protect the environment and their environmental rights in the Bay region. This includes providing tools and training to use the law for promoting clean water and healthy communities, and of course, attorney education. So we train both communities as well as attorneys. The Environmental Action Center is, again, allows us to develop proactive strategies. So this includes implementation and enforcement for our clients and to build medium and long-term strategies. Our research and analytics provides strategic research. Our legal innovation helps develop and execute innovative legal theories to assist our clients. So this is a new model for CLA. It has been a dramatic change over the past few years, and I want to talk a little bit about, I want to do an overview of our work. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. And some insight into where we're going now with our full docket of cases. And you'll see in a moment that I'd like to give an update on some of our litigation. And then after we talk about where we are, I'd like to talk about where we're going, and then we can take some questions. Next slide. Okay. So as you can see, we have a pretty full docket. This represents the staff-led cases, and of course, as part of our new model, it is not only staff-led cases. We still have a broad network of attorneys, of over 200 network attorneys. Will, what are we up to now? I think we're
up to over 250 network attorneys.
Over 250. So we continue to have a great deal of need and requests from the network, and we have actually, Will has been doing a fabulous job of pairing those requests and those needs with a network attorney. We're hitting some pretty impressive benchmarks as far as matching those needs. And so there's an array of all kinds of types of needs from the network, corporate issues, of course, land use issues, clean water issues. Really, there's a broad spectrum of need in the net from our constituency that the network attorneys handle. The staff attorneys work with the network attorneys in the spectrum of cooperative litigation. So we have staff-led cases, pro bono network attorney-led cases, and then a mix where we support each other. The cases I'm about to go over we do have support from our network, but these are staff-led cases. So first is, I'd like to talk about one that's recently been in the headlines, which are the Patapsco and Back River wastewater treatment plants in Baltimore. This is a good example of how we target our resources where they are needed most. These plants represent two of the largest plants in Maryland. The pollution coming from them represents millions of pounds of nitrogen and other pollutants that are going not only into the Back River and the Patapsco, but of course the Bay. There's public health issues, degraded infrastructure issues. We have been involved from the beginning, where our research through Evans Research Center found violations early on in the spring of 2021, I believe. That coincided with Blue Water Baltimore's sampling, and they had found high bacteria levels. So together, we sounded the alarm, and Maryland Department of the Environment took notice. From there, Angela Herron and Evan Isaacson really led the development of this case with Blue Water Baltimore and Alice Volpita, the harbor keeper. As a result, we filed a federal action, a Clean Water Act citizen suit in federal court, and MDE subsequently filed a state action, which Blue Water Baltimore, our client, intervened in. During this time, we have been working hard to work with the city as well as MDE to try to keep the pressure on for the cleanup of these facilities. It's an enormous importance for Baltimore and the Bay. We have filed a preliminary injunction to force the city during the Maryland Environmental Services takeover to hit benchmarks, to have take minimal actions to protect the rivers and the Bay and public health. So this has really kept the pressure on, particularly if this issue fades from the headlines. We want to make sure that this is being done in a stepwise fashion with long-term solutions and not just temporary fixes. The next case I want to talk about is the Maryland Animal Feeding Operation General Permit case. This is essentially the poultry industry in Maryland. This is a case that's been in development for several years, working with the Assateague Coastal Trust. this represents approximately coverage for this general permit represents coverage for approximately 550 poultry operations in the state. Those operations in the general permit do have housekeeping requirements for stormwater. However, there were no controls and are currently no controls over ammonia. Ammonia and nitrogen represents an enormous pollution stream to the tune of tens of millions of pounds of nitrogen each year. Those emissions lead to approximately 5 million pounds of nitrogen delivered to Maryland waters in the Bay each year. We were successful in the Montgomery County Circuit Court. That court ordered the agency to implement ammonia controls and also water quality-based effluent limitations. The Maryland Department of the Environment appealed that, and we applied for a writ of certiorari to the Court of Appeals, which was granted. So that case is ongoing. We actually have filed briefs and we have oral argument November 3rd on that case. So that would, again, another example of targeting resources. This is a case where really low cost controls in this industry would represent major reductions for nitrogen. So it's not a pound of prevention for a pound of cure. It's really very low cost, low tech controls for ammonia that would result in dramatic reductions of nitrogen in Maryland waters in the Bay. Valley proteins, you may have recently seen this. We are finally, as of yesterday, our clients, Shore Rivers and Dorchester Citizens for Planned Growth, signed a three-way consent decree along with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and the Maryland Department of Environment and Valley Proteins. There's a long history here. It's a 15-year-old zombie permit, and what that means is it is an expired permit that has languished. It is an ineffective permit that has very high pollution limits, and there have been chronic permit violations. In around early 2021, when we saw that there were permit violations, Evan, in his research, discovered that the current administration was slated to give Valley Proteins a $15 million grant, which diverts, of course, public funds from much needed public wastewater treatment plants, and they were going to give this money to a private corporation to clean up. We caught that, and I'll talk a little bit about the bill later when we talk about our legislative issues. We've again filed a federal action. Maryland Department of the Environment filed in the state. We intervened in that action, and it led to this consent decree. And while, of course, every negotiation requires some pain on all sides, we are pretty happy that there was a $540,000 penalty to Valley Proteins. They are paying a $160,000 payment towards a fund for monitoring and restoration. And there'll be stipulated penalties and other controls. There's going to be a relatively robust groundwater study to study some of the nitrate pollution in the area. So we're very pleased with that. You can read about that on our website. You can read about that in the paper. It was just in the Sun. Will stop me if I'm missing something or if I'm going too long. But Trap East, I wanted to talk about this case. This is another very interesting case. For those of you familiar with Trap on the Eastern Shore, this development is the largest project on the Eastern Shore. They're trying to build also one of the largest wastewater treatment plants. However, they don't want to call it a wastewater treatment plant. Instead, it is being called and permitted as a groundwater permit, which means essentially a spray field. The Chesapeake Legal Alliance and Shore Rivers challenged that, and we were involved early. Chesapeake Bay Foundation also came onto the litigation, and during this, we successfully got that permit remanded So now this litigation continues. A lot of the local residents have rallied to try to stop it at this point. But what that means as far as a groundwater permit is that instead of having a wastewater treatment plant that is accountable to the TMDL and the Bay model, when they call it a groundwater permit, they're essentially saying that it just goes away. It's there's nutrient uptake from the spray fields, and it's kind of taken off the books. And so this is, there are a lot of reasons to challenge this particular permit, and this is ongoing. And we look forward to seeing what the department does and whether or not this needs to be challenged. Lothian. This is an interesting suite of sites in Lothian, Maryland, along the Patuxent River. We're working with the Patuxent Riverkeeper and local residents on several sites. This is an example of a sacrificial corridor. There are gravel pits, reclamation sites, closed landfills, problematic mobile home pollution sources, septic sources. And the permitting and zoning approvals have essentially led to this sacrificial zone where there are air and water pollution issues, surface groundwater issues, truck traffic, and several environmental justice concerns. So this is, again, there are a suite of issues here that we are keeping up with our clients. And so those issues are ongoing. We have one of our network attorneys, Ryan Kennedy, is working on one aspect of that, a zoning aspect. So we look forward to seeing how that moves forward. Finally, I just want to talk briefly about Abingdon Woods, also ongoing, also to be argued in the Harford County Circuit Court on November 3rd. This case involves development of an over 300-acre area of forested wetlands and streams in the Bush River watershed. And this was all to be done for a 2 million square foot industrial warehouse complex. This is an area that already suffers from overdevelopment, this type of overdevelopment. And it happens to be in the last significant and intact stand of forest in the Bush River watershed. So we've been working with the Gunpowder Riverkeeper and local residents. This permit we also got remanded, and now we are waiting it's been briefed, and we're waiting to argue this particular permit as well. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So legislative wins. We work closely with partners to help with research and education on the background and development of some of these important legislative initiatives. I want to start with two that are recent in recent history, 2021 into 2022. The first one being the House Bill 649, the enforcement bill. This was a critical bill and a huge win for the state. It requires the Department of the Environment to hire inspectors, and particularly to hire staff within the Water and Science Administration of MDE. Along with those hires that are required is minimum requirements for permitting, expired permits, minimum requirements for inspection and real enforcement for any kind of significant non-compliance. So that includes minimum penalties. And so with certain amount of expired permits, they have to hire permit writers if it reaches a certain threshold. So this is an incredibly significant bill. And I think it will have some really long-term benefits for the state and for clean water. We also have something looking back is the Maryland Clean Water Commerce Act. This is something that Rich Hall and Evan Isaacson worked with the Chesapeake Bay Commission to rework a bill for reauthorization of bay restoration funds for clean water projects. And that freed up I think over or $20 million based on that model. With the infrastructure funding coming in, the federal funding, they assisted again the commission for funding for the Clean Streams Fund in Pennsylvania to establish $220 million, under the American Rescue Plan Act. So a good deal of that money went to the Agricultural Conservation Assistance Program, and I think importantly, $22 million went to Clean Water Procurement Program to deal with nutrient and sediment reductions. Now, this is in Pennsylvania, and it is funding for these cleanups. And of course, it's a great start to get the state into on track to meet their TMDL requirements. So that was a big win. Current bills include the House Bill 295, and Delegate Sarah Love and Senator Sarah Elfrith drove this bill, sponsored this bill. It's a stormwater climate change and bay cleanup. And this is an important bill because it reflects data integrity. So with the agency, it will be required to look at the newest data. In other words, storm intensity, duration, and frequency. And that is critical moving forward, because if we're using old numbers and we're using outdated stormwater frequency and intensity, then permits will be built. It will be built in. They'll be built to fail. So this was an important bill. Back to, I had mentioned before, the $15 million for Valley Proteins. Senate Bill 354 addressed that. That caps and stops taxpayer dollars, clean water dollars that would go to projects like wastewater treatment plant upgrades, and not to private corporations. So it caps that and creates some more transparency in that program. A couple of more, I just want to mention in a couple of environmental justice bills. House Bill 1200 requires permit applications to include EJ screening. So it's not cumulative impact bill, but it helps require applications to at least look at those types of impacts. And similarly, the House Bill 1207, the Environmental Justice Commission Reform Bill, requires reform of the commission. And the commission is important because it analyzes laws and regulations for impacts on environmental justice and issues. And we're proud of that one because we had two of our law clerks worked on that extensively, Ariel King and Theo Miller, which was actually a great exercise for that program. And briefly, there's the Climate Solutions Now Act, which is centers around greenhouse gas reductions, and sort of a sister program, which is the establishment of the Office of Resilience, which builds out policy and infrastructure needs to adapt to that climate change. So lots going on. Some bills on the horizon, including environmental standing in Maryland, citizen suit standing. So lots happening in the legislative wins and legislative roundup. And go to the next. Thank you. Molly Brown's Center Community Legal Education. This is there's been a ton of trainings going on, and some of the highlights are our conference presentations. You can see that we try our best to educate our partners and the community. Some of the webinars, I think, have been really a fabulous success. We've gotten rave reviews over a couple of them, interest-based communication and conservation. And that's a way we have a series of talks that help in negotiations and just communications where it supports our communities to get better results of when you have stakeholder issues. Molly led Embracing Our Differences, which was the structure of state government. She gave that presentation to the Chesapeake Bay Commission, which really illuminated the differences in state legislatures, and I think really helped different state legislators understand each other's processes. Another very interesting one, before I wrap this section up, is our ECHO trainings. That is the, let's see if I can remember that, enforcement compliance. I'm not sure what ECHO, I can't remember what ECHO stands for, but it is the database that EPA uses to look for any kind of non-compliance and permits. So you can use that database, which is it is a clearinghouse for all the state data. And so that kind of training allows different groups to be able to check permits and see what the compliance history is, to see if there's a problem. They can try to match it with pollutants. They can look at the type of loading in their watershed. So it's a fascinating tool. We use it all the time. To that end, thank you, Molly. It's the enforcement and compliance history online. To that end, can you go to the next slide, please? To that end, I wanted to talk briefly about the violations tracker. This is something that Evan Isaacson has co-developed with Chesapeake Commons, and thanks to the RBC Foundation for funding that. This is a very interesting tracker and really an important tool. It is a direct result of the transparency bill. Again, looking back on some of the legislative wins, and that required data to be available online in Maryland, and really has been a boon to advocates and citizens, because it includes a wealth of information, including inspection reports. And those inspection reports include pictures of sites and descriptions of those violations. So, and of course, permitting information, all kinds of environmental information to protect clean water. And it helps the community and advocates build their own investigations, so they can look at their own citizen data and see what the inspections have to say. So with that provision and with the enactment of MDE's online data, the violations tracker now looks at facilities across the state and identifies facilities that are in non-compliance and links to the inspection reports. So it's an incredible tool. We use it already. Our partners are already using it. So I just wanted to highlight that. To look ahead, things like the the violations tracker, and some of our recent priorities and our current docket is a result of how we are prioritizing cases. So as CLA's network attorneys expand, and as our cooperative work with the network expands, we really are reprioritizing how we look at cases and how we look at our caseload. And so it includes considerations like, of course, case impact, vulnerable communities, areas that we have not worked before, or areas that we have historically not had constituents in. So it has been, as a part of our strategic plan, we have developed a strategic roadmap that requires us to consider these things as we implement our strategic plan, and to better use our resources across the watershed. This has necessitated the new structure that I described at the beginning. I think it will also necessitate hiring of a new staff attorney, at least one, as we try to replicate what we've done in Maryland, in Pennsylvania and Virginia. We've already expanded into those states, and we're starting to do work. But of course, we'll need to staff up in order to effectively replicate what we're doing there. Next slide. Oh, okay. So
Dave, we
think,
have one question to start you off.
okay,
What is the biggest challenge for CLA this year?
as I was discussing, I think, listen, we're a small, medium shop with limited resources and just an enormous, we have a lot of strategies. We do a lot of research. We have an enormous amount of requests, both from our close partners to the staff. And of course, our request for assistance from all of our constituents it's a long list. And so one of our biggest challenges is when and how to say no. We try our best to place every case that comes in, but prioritizing those cases is really a very deliberative process. And it's something that we are taking very seriously. And particularly as we do more environmental justice work, we are taking a closer look at vulnerable communities. So I would say our biggest challenge right now is to build out the capacity to do more. And as we are doing that, we have to really prioritize our work.
A second question we have here is, what has been the most interesting case you have been involved with?
Well, that's an easy one for me because I think the animal feeding operation general permit case is fascinating because, again, it's really bang for the buck. It is with just sort of an ounce of prevention, you get a pound of cure. And it is looking at the ammonia emissions, which are essentially blasted out of fans that blow the air out of the chicken houses horizontally, and it pretty quickly deposits onto waters of the state, wetlands, basically near shore lands, and quickly is delivered into the rivers and the bay. And there's a ton of science out there that estimates that. The Bay model has estimates of it. So it's not a secret, and it's an enormous source. And so we are anxious to argue this before the Court of Appeals, the Maryland Supreme Court. And we hope that they'll agree with the circuit court.
Another question we have, does CLA plan to expand its animal feeding operations work in other states?
Yes. Now, good question. Certainly, we want to start in the Bay states. Each program is very different. Pennsylvania and Virginia are very different programs. Of course, the facilities are they're run similarly. One thing I should note is the poultry industry is run on something called a tournament system. So integrators, and think of the big national, multinational companies that process and sell chicken at the supermarket. They are the purchasers of the product that all the chicken farms grow. However, they really own the chickens cradle to grave. They deliver hatchlings to the farms, and then they take them back to process them. The integrator system, which is what the poultry industry is called, is very tightly run. And so it's not regulatory, but the onerous requirements for controls, for technologies, for expenditures, for record keeping, by far are from the integrators through the contract system to those contract growers, not by the regulators. And so that is very similar across states. The regulatory scheme, the permitting scheme, and they're almost all general permits, are very different between Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. So it's something that we have to do very thoughtfully. Of course, you have to be thoughtful about onerous regulations on growers and industries, and balance that with how you're prosecuting a case or bringing a case. So that's a long answer to say, yes, we are considering and working on this strategy in other states.
And just to remind everyone, you can use the chat feature to place any questions that you have for Dave and the rest of CLA. We do have another question, Dave. Where do you see CLA in 5 years?
Well, that's it. You know, I started to answer that, and I answer that carefully because right now, as I mentioned, we have such a full docket, and we need to think carefully about how we expand into Virginia and Pennsylvania. I think in 5 years we will be have the type of presence we have in Maryland in the Bay States. So we'll have more of a mid-Atlantic influence. And so my hope and our plan is to really have a robust program and operations that ensure that, you know, all the Bay States have the services they need provided by CLA and our partners, because we do our best to provide to build coalitions as we provide our services.
Another question here. Is there an automatic trigger for MDE when a facility is reported on the violations tracker? What happens when a facility is reported?
That's a great question. So that's a very meat and potatoes question within the agency, but I can tell you what is supposed to happen. You know, our violations tracker is a privately run violations tracker it's something CLA developed with Chesapeake Commons. What's supposed to happen under the enforcement bill is that, as I mentioned before, when there is significant noncompliance is a bit of an algorithm. It has to do with the type of pollutant, the concentration or the size of the pollution stream, et cetera, whether it's a chronic violation. If that rises to that level, then there are minimum actions that have to be taken. Inspection has to happen. There are often minimum penalties for a triggered violation. But what happens when a facility is reported is there's a complaint. So that's reported as a complaint. What we try to have happen, to answer it very frankly, is we try our best to make sure that MDE sends out an inspector and that it's not ignored, because unfortunately sometimes not a lot happens. However, particularly with this new enforcement bill from the past year and a half, we think that at the very least an inspection will happen. We see the inspection report, we can follow up with the resident or the advocate, and it's just a much better process. I see a question here, Will. It's what is your impression of MDE's performance? I hesitate to ask this. What is most needed to improve their effectiveness? Are there any improvements coming? That's a good question. That's a hard question to answer. In large part because, you know, we have good relationships with a lot of staff and assistant attorney general. We do see a lot of room for improvement. We hope that the enforcement bill and the transparency bills both work together to provide lots of resources. And I think that's, of course, as you can imagine, always a difficulty for the agency. You have not enough permit writers, not enough inspectors. And the inspectors are supposed to be doing over 100 inspections a year. And when you have a fraction of the inspectors that you need, same with permit writers, you're just not going to get the same results. I hope that the interim and successor, the interim secretary and the successor, the next secretary, takes this enforcement bill and the resources needed for MDE very seriously, because there are very dedicated staff that I think are just have not enough resources.
All right. There have been significant changes in Maryland's funding landscape over the years. Has CLA successfully navigated that transition, or do funding needs remain? Sounds like with the planned programmatic growth that CLA has been able to weather that change successfully. So great to hear about all of your recent successes.
So the question is about funding?
Yes. With significant changes in Maryland's funding landscape over the years, has CLA successfully navigated that transition, or do funding needs remain?
That's a good question. You know, I look forward. I hope in the near future where we have, you know, obviously you have to continue to communicate what you do and try to build your constituency, and part of that constituency is going to be individual donors, excuse me, and foundation grants. I hope we have done a good job. I think I'm certain we have in the near term. I hope to continue that. We are trying to do our best to communicate some of the metrics of success. So when I walked through the cases before in the legislative wins, you know, it's long-winded. It's difficult to really parse all of the impacts we have. And so one of the challenges is to communicate that to funders and donors. So we have been getting more creative in trying to communicate all of the ways that our work is important. So of course, it's not just acres protected. It's not nutrient or pollution prevented. It's, you know, advocacy with the administration. It's working with agency staff. It's raising the bar. It's working on legislation, and a combination of issues that all kind of work in sync to raise the bar, to improve environmental protection in the watershed. So I hope we are doing a good job. We're open. We're always open for suggestions. So I hope that answers your question.
All right, we still have a little bit of time for questions. So if anyone has an additional question, please enter that in the chat box.
I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask a question, but Will Halnan is our new outreach coordinator and staff attorney. So he has seen and overseen a big expansion in recently of our network attorney base. And I think one of the things, Will, that we've noticed is the expansion of the attorney network coincides with the expansion of our constituency. So we kind of see this one-to-one growth where we get more network attorneys interested, and at the same time we get more requests for assistance. So it's a happy problem to have, but I have noticed that, and I don't know if you have any comments on that.
I will say that yes, with more attorneys, especially in Pennsylvania and Virginia, joining our pro bono network, we've also seen a rise in constituents from those areas as well.
Okay, well, if there are no other questions, I see we're on our last slide, which I think is an important one, that for every dollar donated in 2021, we provided $5 in free legal services. I would say that's actually a pretty big underestimate, because when we calculate things like attorney's fees for a Clean Water Act case, it is a tiny fraction of the actual time we put in building the case, researching, working with partners, working with communities to do the work that we do. So, you know, every dollar donated is important.
And if you think of any additional questions you would like to ask that you weren't able to ask during this presentation, feel free to email either me at william@chesapeakelegal.org or Molly at mbrown@chesapeakelegal.org.
And this presentation will be available on the website. So I think, please, if you're interested, take the time to investigate our website. We put a couple of links up in the presentation, and it goes over some of our legislative roundup. You can look at some of the cases, some of the press headlines, we try to make it as educational as possible. So we invite you to go to our website and explore. If there are no other questions, thank you, everybody. Thanks for spending your evening with us. I hope it's been informative. Please reach out, as Will said, please reach out to us with any questions.